All right, let's move on to some other issues. The federal government, has commissioned a review into Australia's compulsory superannuation scheme. Now, currently, we all receive 9.5%. By 2025, contributions will lift to 12% if changes are not made before that time. Earlier today, in a speech in Brisbane, the opposition leader Anthony Albanese seized on a growing debate inside the federal coalition about whether these planned super increases should proceed, and he fired this salvo.
Like Medicare, universal superannuation is a great Labor legacy. Sadly, support for it is not universal. At the moment, we are witnessing an unholy coalition attacking the increase in the superannuation guarantee.
Well, someone who wants to see debate and isn't scared off by Labor is Queensland Liberal Senator Gerard Rennick. He joins me now from our Brisbane studio. Thank you very much for coming on the show. This is your first time, I think, so I'm delighted that you're with us tonight. It's an important topic, superannuation. I know people become a bit lax about it in their 20s and 30s, a bit more focused in their 40s, and it becomes critical as they start to reach retirement age. Very hard to top it up when you're really on the cusp of retirement. So it's an important debate, I think, to have at all stages of our employment history. One of the concerns people have, though, is so much of what would be potential pay rises that they have through their working life are put away into superannuation, eaten up by fees and government taxes and other things. And employers are saying if it goes up to 12%, it will dramatically limit their opportunities to give people extra pay or indeed to hire more people. What's your response on the issue?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's good to be here. Look, first of all, I'd just like to call out Anthony Albanese in his statement that superannuation is universal. That is incorrect. Low-income earners, stay-at-home parents, carers and unemployed people don't get superannuation. And that's the point. Superannuation was supposed to replace the pension. But the reality is a large chunk of the Australian population, including important sectors of the community, don't actually get access to superannuation, number one. A large chunk of the tax concessions go to the wealthier, 20 to 30%. Another $35 billion is spent on managing superannuation, and $600 billion is invested offshore. So I would argue that superannuation isn't really part of the real economy. And what happens is when workers pay their 9.5% away to someone they've never met and they have to wait until they're 60, that's taking money out of the real economy. Now, if that gets lifted to 12%, that's going to siphon more money out of workers' pockets, and it's also going to increase costs to business as well. So both business and the workers will be worse off if super is increased from 9.5% to 12%, in my view.
Yeah, you recently made some comments, and I don't disagree with you here, where you say super's failing because it buys assets, it doesn't build assets. Now, we've got a desperate need for water infrastructure in Australia. We'd all love to see more dams. When people talk about things like the Bradfield scheme, it's $16 billion, and there's all this consternation that the government in Canberra can't afford that. I think they should. They can spend 200 on subs. I think they can spend 15 on water. But these are the sort of assets, nation-building assets, that most Australians at home would say, well, why isn't the big super funds investing in Australia? Tell me where their money's going.
Well, look, that's an excellent point, Peter. So there's almost $3 trillion invested in super. $600 billion of that is invested offshore in equities and international bonds. Only 6% invested in infrastructure. Now, of that, I'm not sure how much is invested in new infrastructure versus existing infrastructure. But the problem with superannuation is that by investing in existing assets, all you're doing is actually raising the price of existing assets, and then in order to fund that buy-in, you have to increase the cost of essential services. So what we've seen in the last 30 years is governments have privatised, they've privatised a lot of these essential services and infrastructure assets that provide essential services, and they've been bought up by super funds at very high prices because every week, there's very little competition in superannuation. Every week, 9.5% of everyone's income goes into superannuation funds, and they just continue to buy the same assets. Now, in order to get a return on that, then they have to increase the cost of roads and everything like that. Now, what I would like to see happen, or what I think is something that we should consider, is having a government default superannuation fund rather than defaulting into industry super funds. The first point of default should be a government industry super fund. And that,
Senator, can I just step in there? No, can I just step in there because you make a very, very good point. Now, there was a debate in the last 12 to 18 months about the Commonwealth setting up inside the Future Fund, and I know the Future Fund Chairman, Peter Costello, was open-minded on this question. The government, the argument goes, should be setting up a fund for people inside the Future Fund. It gets great returns, better than most industry super funds, and those Australians who don't want an industry super fund, they don't want the rigmarole of trying to have a self-managed fund, and you've got to say, particularly under the Labor government, they make self-managed super funds harder and harder to run. And we know a lot of the private sector are getting out, after the Hayne Royal Commission, are getting out of superannuation. So the default basically is more and more into industry funds. When this happened, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister were very reluctant to enable the Future Fund to set up these accounts for Australians. How much sort of traction have you got on that internally?
Look, I haven't spoken to Josh personally about it, or Scott, but it is something that I intend to speak to Josh about, because there's actually an opportunity here for a couple of win-wins. First of all, it's a way to finance essential services, and especially dams. We are crying out for dams in this country, not only because we need the water, but it's also a way of bridging the gap between the different factions in the party for clean energy, because water will provide jobs in the regions. It'll also provide high-value cropping. It'll provide flood mitigation. It'll reduce insurance costs. It's a way to actually give immigrants, if we do want high immigration, which I'm not a big fan of, but if immigrants are going to go to the bush, it's a way of creating work out there, and it's a way for creating income that can then build schools and hospitals for people in the city. And I think people in the city have forgotten that it's actually the infrastructure in the regions that generates income to provide essential services in the city. And the other opportunity, the other win-win is there's $34 billion a year spent in managing superannuation. That's very expensive. That's as much as Australia spends on its military each year. Now, if, say, a third of that, and this is all speculation, a third of that went into a Commonwealth default super fund and we halved the fees, we could still earn $6 billion in fees, and we could commit to investing those fees in more infrastructure. So it becomes a win-win both for the taxpayer and also the people who rely on essential services.
Senator Rennick, it all makes a lot of sense. It would also neutralise, in some respects, the power of the industry super funds, and through them, obviously, the union movement, which is only going stronger and stronger when the move's up to 12%. So it doesn't surprise me that Anthony Albanese was championing it so much today in Brisbane. Senator Rennick, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Peter.